future. We're focused on planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, connected community. Learn more at northfloridatpo.com. Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR and the WJCT News team.
Good morning. I'm Ann Schindler. On today's First Coast Connect, with the governor vowing budget vetoes, what First Coast projects hang in the balance? We talk with government expert Chris Hand about what the state budget brings to the First Coast and what is left behind. We also discuss the financial and political implications of turning a West Side former military base into an ICE detention center. And finally, a chance to find your new best friend at a mega pet adoption event this weekend. Join the conversation. Give us a call at 904-549-2937. You can also email First Coast Connect at WJCT.org or tag us on social media. It's all ahead this hour after the day's news.
Live from NPR News, I'm Corva Coleman. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has finished a news conference at the Pentagon. He and the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff discussed the U.S. military strikes on 3 Iranian nuclear sites last weekend. The CIA has released a new report that aligns with President Trump's declaration the main site at Fordo was obliterated. Another intelligence assessment that came to light earlier this week suggested the damage was minimal. Hegseth says that the Trump administration's view is supported by others.
Here's the head of the UN Atomic Energy Agency this morning, Rafael Grossi. U.S. and Israeli strikes caused enormous damage to Iran's nuclear sites.
However, Hegseth said he is unaware of any intelligence that Iran moved uranium out of the sites ahead of the U.S. strikes. At Turkey's eastern border with Iran, people continue to cross into the city of Van. They're not always fleeing a single moment of crisis, but a sense that life at home is no longer sustainable. Reporter Gurcha Saraçoğlu has more from Van, Turkey.
Iranians of all ages arrive quietly, carrying what they can, but more often bringing uncertainty than luggage. Ferhat, who is 25, came from Tehran. He only shared his first name out of fear of government retaliation.
I don't know if my house was bombed.
He left behind his parents and a generational divide. His mother still supports Iran's clerical regime, and it won't be enough for him to return home, even if peace holds.
Nothing could make me happier than that. It's really hard to know because if the war stops, you'll be living under this regime that has been plundering the country's wealth and youth and time and everything.
For now, Ferhat hopes to stay in Istanbul for a few months. For NPR News, Gökçe Saraçoğlu in Van, Turkey.
President Trump's budget director, Russell Vought, is defending the administration's request to claw back more than $9 billion in foreign aid and funding for public media. NPR's Deirdre Walsh reports on the next steps in the Senate.
Senators from both parties pressed Vought about the impact the administration's $1 billion cut for public media would have for emergency services and local news, especially in rural states. Chair Susan Collins says she shares the administration's concerns that some content is ideologically biased, but pointed out most of the money goes to local stations.
There are, however, more targeted approaches to addressing that bias at NPR than rescinding all of the funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
The House narrowly approved the administration's request, and the Senate has until July 18th to vote. If it fails to approve it, the administration must release the funds for the targeted programs. Deirdre Walsh, NPR News, the Capitol.
You're listening to NPR News.
You're listening to WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. Good morning, I'm Stephen Ponson. It is now 9:04. After more than 25 years serving up sandwiches, steaks, and salads, Seven Bridges Grill and Brewery in Tinseltown closed permanently this week. The restaurant on Gate Parkway is owned by Kelly Companies of Southern California, which also owned Ragtime Tavern in Atlantic Beach. That restaurant also closed back in January. News partners at the Jacksonville Daily Record report this is the second high-profile restaurant to close in Tinseltown in recent weeks. The Hooters nearby on Southside Boulevard closed back on June 5th. You may have noticed fewer bees flying around your yard this summer. Clara Hoquita Garcia says that's because of the viruses that have been attacking bee colonies.
The U.S. Department of Agriculture reports that the two viruses are being spread by a mite that has become resistant to emitress, a common pesticide used by beekeepers. Ryan Verbeek has been a beekeeper in Hillsborough County for over 10 years. He says the combination of the mite and our dry spring are causing the larger-than-normal colony losses.
When you look outside, you look at the front of your vehicle, how many insects do you have stuck to your grill right now? There is an overall decline of insects, and the honeybees is included in it.
Verbeek says bees are important to both the environment and people as they pollinate flowers, fruits, and vegetables. And with mites becoming more resistant to emitress, researchers are looking for new solutions to control them. I'm Clara Hoquita Garcia in Tampa.
It'll be a warm afternoon in Jacksonville and Northeast Florida and will stay mostly dry.
For NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include AG1, introducing AG1 Next Gen, a daily drink with vitamins, minerals, and probiotics to support overall health. Learn more at drinkag1.com/science.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
Good morning. I'm Ann Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Today, with the governor vowing to veto some $500 million from the state budget, government expert Chris Hand breaks down what's gained and what could still be lost to the governor's veto pen. Later in the program, a statewide adoption event could be a chance to bring home your new best friend. But first, as a line item veto pen is poised to undo many projects in the hard-won state budget, we're looking at how the First Coast might fare. Here to walk us through some of the scenarios is Chris Hand. He joins us each month to talk state and local headlines. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning, Ann. Great to see you.
Great to see you as well. So much to discuss, whether we're talking about funding for nursing programs, honors programs at local colleges, land preservation, resilience. But if you would just remind us how we got here. This was a long and acrimonious session.
And what a trip it's been. You know, the legislative session was supposed to end on May the 2nd. Under our state constitution, we have a 60-day legislative session. In odd-numbered years like this one, it starts at the beginning of March and ends at the beginning of May, except when it doesn't end at the beginning of May, which was the case this year. Obviously, legislative leaders could not agree on a final budget between the House and the Senate by May the 2nd, so they went into overtime on this budget, really significantly into overtime, 6 weeks past the original period for the legislative session before, on June 16th, they finally passed a budget which is going to the governor now for his review and potential veto of line items, as we'll talk about in a little bit. But this was really sort of a fight over a variety of things this year, and one was kind of the very changed relationship between the governor and the legislature, particularly the governor and the Florida House of Representatives. This had been a situation where the governor, very powerful over the first 6 years he was in office. Now we begin to see in 2025 the legislature sort of reawaken to its co-equal status in state government. Begin to push back against the governor really for the first time in his time in office and exercise some of that independent authority. We saw it very early in 2025 where the governor called a special session to address immigration. The House did what's called a gavel in and gavel out very quickly. They said, thank you, we're gone, and now we're going to bring our own special session back and pass our own bills, and then actually overrode some budget vetoes from last year. So very early, that tone was set that this was going to be a different kind of session from last year. So I think that was one area. Specifically, one area of dissension, not just between the governor and the House, but also between the House and the Senate, was what would happen on the issue of tax cuts. The governor, one of his big priorities has been to significantly reduce or eliminate property taxes here in the state of Florida, something that would actually require a constitutional amendment ultimately to pass. State House Speaker Danny Perez, his priority has been cutting the state sales tax. We have sort of a base rate in the state of about 6% that he wanted to cut down to 5.25%. That was an area of disagreement where the Senate was trying to sort of mediate between the two. So all of those factors combined to ensure that the legislature didn't land the budget by its normal time, but did land it by June the 16th, which is important because the fiscal year ends next Monday, June the 30th. There has to be a new state budget in place by July 1, the start of the new fiscal year.
And that issue over taxes, I mean, as you said, the House Speaker, Daniel Perez, was kind of wanting to cut sales taxes. The governor was concerned that would interfere with his wish to cut property taxes. The Senate sort of overall concerned, like, are we going to have enough money to just pay for this government if we cut these taxes? And so they kind of fell somewhere in the middle. They cut some business taxes. They kind of permanently cut some taxes on some storm-related things like batteries, but not any of the big initiatives that anybody was kind of hoping for.
That's right, Ann. The major there's about $1.3 billion in tax relief in this budget. As you say, the lion's share of that was the elimination of the sales tax on commercial leases. This is something the legislature's been working toward for years. They've been sort of steadily reducing kind of the state portion of that all the way down to 2%. This year, they've eliminated that final 2% and also eliminated any local option sales taxes on commercial leases. So, for example, setting aside the local piece, if you're paying $1,000 for commercial rent each month, you were probably paying about $20 each month in state commercial lease sales taxes. You won't be anymore as of October the 1st because of that sales tax. And then there were also, permanent relief for, back to school, the kind of back to school supplies and clothes, holiday, and as you say, for hurricane preparedness. But a lot of the big decisions on taxes, and were sort of punted to the 2026 session, where clearly the governor is going to be looking to put some sort of initiative on the ballot that year to, again, either significantly reduce or eliminate property taxes overall. This is a matter of great controversy, both within Tallahassee, but also around the state. Obviously, local governments, city and county governments depend heavily on property taxes to pay for core services like police, fire, public works, parks. Those are the types of things that city and counties use property taxes to fund. Just to give you an example, of the current year City of Jacksonville budget, which is about $1.8 billion, more than $1 billion of that is supported by property taxes. So this has a huge impact on local budgets. So that proposal to do something about property taxes, very controversial, but it has now been punted to 2026.
One of the issues that caused a deeper divide between these leaders also had to do with a charity that was initiated, kind of closely associated with the governor's wife, Casey DeSantis, Hope Florida, which was the subject of an investigation, isn't the subject of a criminal investigation, but was the subject of a probe by the House leadership. A committee kind of took that on, and it was something that the speaker supported or defended, at least, and that was another split between him and the governor.
A very bitter split that sort of continues to this day. In fact, the governor this just came up in remarks and some back and forth he had with reporters the other day. So it's obvious that's still a very kind of raw nerve between the governor and the state house speaker. As everybody knows, that is a kind of a continuing kind of question moving forward. Funds for Hope Florida is a sort of a state government initiative, but it's been supported by a direct support organization, a nonprofit called the Hope Florida Foundation. The controversy has been over the fact that about $10 million in state funds that were diverted to Hope Florida Foundation ended up going to fund efforts to defeat constitutional amendments in the 2024 election. Again, as you say, there's still continuing investigation over that, but we saw some ramifications from that in the state budget. So, for example, in his budget request this year, the governor had requested the creation and the funding of some positions in the Department of Children and Family Services to support the Hope Florida initiative. The legislature decided not to fund those at all in this budget. So, again, something that we need to continue to watch, because there may be continuing ramifications, not only in terms of the investigations that are happening, but also in the work of state government and how some of these budget questions are settled going forward.
And so some of the debates are about big issues. Some of them have been a little petty, as you kind of pointed with the immigration gavel in, gavel out, kind of who wins, calling a special session. And some of that has, continues to this day when it comes to the vetoes that are coming. I mean, certainly someone like House Speaker Daniel Perez, who's been on the other side of this, so many things with the governor, might have concerns about things that he's asked for in his district. But the governor now saying that he wants to veto at least $500 million from this budget. Um, Kind of going back and forth with Perez in the last week or so, saying, well, Perez has said that the budget is less than it was last year. He's kind of saying it's a smaller budget than what the governor asked for by about 500 million. And now the governor's saying, well, 500 million is now his target to perhaps veto. I think his quote was, if some of the House leadership is saying that we're spending too much or whatever, then don't I have to take at least 500 million off to get under what I recommended? And so kind of a little tit for tat in terms of trying to bring this budget in at a place they can both take some credit for.
And I think where we are is probably best expressed by a song from a musical. Anything you can do, I can do better. That's sort of where I think Danny Perez and Ron DeSantis are right now. Governor DeSantis came in with a budget this year with that was $115.6 billion. The final budget is $500 million less than that, $115.1 billion. Now the governor said, well, at least I need to then kind of lower it by another $500 million. I actually expect his veto pen to be even heavier than $500 million. I would not be surprised, as has been the case in previous years, if it was closer to $1 billion that he vetoes from the state budget. As you sort of alluded to, I think it would not be surprising if some of those vetoes fall on State House of Representative priorities. So, for people who are tracking in particular projects to kind of figure out which ones might get the veto pen, I think House member projects is an area where one might want to pay attention, given the sort of the rift between the governor and the House of Representatives. But also, each year there's a taxpayer advocacy organization called Florida Tax Watch that releases each year what they call their list of budget turkeys. And by that, they mean projects that really haven't gone through the normal kind of appropriations process but end up in the budget. They've got more than $400 million in projects they've identified on their list this year. That is often an area where governors look in making vetoes. So, again, the state budget takes effect on July 1st. I expect the governor to act between now and then. To be as specific as possible, I would guess this occurs probably either on Friday or on Monday, but I would expect probably more than $500 million of vetoes when the governor's had his chance to review the budget.
And Monday, essentially, the deadline to kind of make those decisions.
That's right. The way the budget's written, it says, technically it becomes law whenever the governor signs the budget or July 1st, whichever is later. But if it happens after July 1st, the budget's retroactive to July 1. So effectively, either way, the budget will take effect on July 1. But I expect the governor to act before July 1.
All right. Well, I do want to get into some local recommendations, but if you're just joining us, we're talking to Chris Hand about state budget proposals and still possible funding vetoes. We welcome your calls, comments, or questions, and you can reach us at 904-549-2937. You can also email us at firstcoastconnect@wjct.org, or you can reach out on Instagram, X, or Facebook at FCC On Air. So some of the things that we're talking about, you noted the last year the governor vetoed about almost $1 billion, $950 million from the budget, including 50 First Coast projects that totaled about $70 million. So let's look at some of the things that did get funded so far and kind of how those might fare in the hours and days ahead. One thing that caught my eye that I thought was interesting, a classical academy funding. They got a gym funded. That is a local charter school that's in Mixontown. In that area, they got $3 million. And I'm curious about that because there was another classical academy, Duval Cornerstone Classical Academy, also got $750,000 for a turf field, another athletic field. And this kind of comes on a controversy that the city council had a couple of years back, where they also funded a gym for a classical academy charter school. Now, that one I think is going to be split in terms of having some public access. But what is are we seeing any trends in terms of funding for these schools that are somewhat function under the public school system, but are also often for profit? They're privately operated and not traditional public schools.
Well, I think it's sort of in keeping with, kind of a general trend in kind of state education policy, and which is to fund more, obviously, than just traditional public schools. Something else that was in the budget beyond, I mean, as you're correctly pointing out, there is $3 million in the budget for that gym at Jacksonville Classical Academy, but there's even a bigger expenditure in the budget of $4 billion for the state's voucher, or what they call Florida Empowerment Scholarship Program, that allows any family to take scholarship money and use that at a private or a parochial school in the state of Florida. So I think all of this is in keeping with what the state of Florida, direction in which it's moved in recent years, is to provide additional funding for schools that are not sort of traditional public schools. Now, of course, this tends to be a zero-sum game. There's only a finite kind of pot of money in the budget. So obviously something that draws concern and some controversy among kind of supporters of the traditional public schools. And we are seeing around the state, school systems in all 67 counties dealing with a variety of funding challenges, having to kind of cut their budgets and deal with some of these issues, partially because of some of these funding transitions that have occurred. But some of the individual funding you're talking about, I think, is part of a larger shift in the way state government has viewed education funding in recent years.
And it's worth saying that when the governor comes to town, he very often speaks at a charter school. I think he's appeared once or twice at a classical academy. And so they might have a little bit more protection when it comes to a budget veto than somewhere else. I want to take a call, if we can, from Susan in Mandarin. Good morning, Susan. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you for. Oh,
Go ahead,
sorry.
Susan. I don't know if we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. So Chris Hand is an expert on Duval's charter, and I've been trying to Google this question. I can't find the answer, and what a great opportunity to ask him. How do you change Duval's charter? A school board member, April Carney, said at a board meeting the other day that she wants a J1 bill to change our charter so she can hire an attorney of her choice rather than the school board going through the Office of General Counsel. And so my basic question is, how do you change Duval's charter? Thank you.
Thanks, Susan.
Susan, that's a good question. There are a variety of ways to change the city of Jacksonville charter. One is there are certain charter amendments that the council itself can pass with sort of a supermajority. More fundamental charter amendments require sort of a popular vote. But in many cases, as you point out, legislative approval is required as well. Cities and counties are political subdivisions of the state of Florida. So ultimately, you oftentimes have to see legislative involvement. That's probably why School Board Member Carney is talking about a J1 bill, a local bill, to get legislative approval for a charter change. But you also speak to what has been kind of one of the bigger issues in consolidated Jacksonville, which is who makes the decision as to the provision of legal services. We have a unique Office of General Counsel that provides legal services to every different part of the consolidated government. As you know, that sometimes leads to conflict between some of the different components of government, and the General Counsel is empowered to issue binding legal opinions to resolve those. This came up several years ago when there was an issue between the Duval County Schools and the City Council over who had the ability to put a sales tax initiative on the budget, on the ballot, to fund school construction and renovation. The General Counsel's office took the position of you have to, we provide your legal advice. School board had a different one. There was some litigation about that. So, Susan, as you probably know, this is an age-old question. But again, at the end of the day, citizens can change the charter through an initiative. There are some ways that council can change the charter. And in many cases, the legislature has to weigh in through a local bill like you talk about.
And that, could be facilitated by a charter change, but there have been instances in the past where various authorities or branches of city government or county government have hired their own attorneys for various purposes, outside attorneys. And that happens without a charter change, right? I mean, when the school board was battling with the city over whether or not they could put a tax referendum on the ballot, they had their own legal counsel.
Well, they had their own legal counsel provided by the city. The issue in those cases, yes, and as you point out, in many cases, different elements of the consolidated city hire their own outside counsel with the permission and ultimately reporting to the general counsel. The issue in that case was the school board wanted to hire their own outside counsel. The general counsel's office said, no, that has to kind of report through us, and the way the charter reads, who controls legal services. They said, we don't want that, and so that's why the litigation ensued. They actually had some volunteer attorneys who were representing them in that case. But in these other cases where there are outside counsel, that is a situation where the general counsel approves of that.
Gotcha.
And sometimes there are counsel who are housed in those agencies. For example, JEA, a very sophisticated, large sort of business enterprise that happens to be publicly owned, has multiple attorneys who are housed at JEA, but ultimately report up to the Office of General Counsel.
Gotcha. I want to take a call as well from Daryl in St. Augustine. Good morning, Daryl. Go ahead.
Good morning, Ann. Good morning, Mr. Hand. My question is, Governor DeSantis vetoed the free kill law, even though 93% of the House and the Senate passed it. So that makes it about, I think, 5 senators and 4 House representatives voted to keep it, and 139 voted to pass it. And DeSantis went against those 139, didn't seem to care what the representatives thought. But do you have any insight as to why the House and Senate didn't do a veto override with such a dominant support for it?
That's a good question, Daryl. And we should just clarify, this is kind of what's referred to sometimes as a loophole in the medical malpractice law in Florida. Basically limits people who can sue for medical malpractice if the person, doesn't have children and they're of a certain age, kind of seen as an adult, but not maybe with direct dependents.
Right, and this was actually a bill to remove that loophole that was actually sponsored by a legislator from Northeast Florida, Senator Clay Yarborough, who was the kind of primary sponsor of that. And as Danny says, the governor did announced that he was going to veto that bill. He ultimately did. His announcement was somewhat controversial because he said, one of the reasons he was vetoing the bill is that he didn't think people should receive a, quote, jackpot under these circumstances. Obviously, for folks who have lost a family member, that was very controversial language for him to use. I think the reason that it hasn't been subject of an override vote, I think the State House Speaker has addressed this, and I believe he said that he plans to bring the bill back next year. So rather than go through the override process now, they intend to bring this bill back in the 2026 session and kind of take it up again then.
Is that easier, though? I mean, this bill has been around for years and years, and this was kind of really the first time it made it over the transom. So, I mean, is it easier to bring it back and kind of go through this whole process again than it would be to try to do an override?
Well, I think one question may be timing. Remember that next year's session, which is in an even-numbered year, starts 2 months earlier. It runs from January until March, as opposed to March until May. So functionally, very soon, we are already going to be in the 2026 legislative session cycle. Is not in the not too distant future. Committees will start meeting. They'll get organized. So again, there are a variety of ways they could approach this. They could potentially try and do an override vote at a later time. But I think what's much more likely is what the House speakers indicated. Given that the next session is not that far away, from a timing standpoint, it may make more sense from a legislative calendaring perspective to bring it back, during the next regular session.
I love those changing sessions that kind of keep us Googling every year to sort of remind ourselves of the rules. I do want to ask about a project that could have some implications. It isn't necessarily included in this budget because it really has just come up, but it's this question of whether or not Camp Blanding or a portion of Camp Blanding here in Jacksonville should be transformed into an ICE detention center. This is kind of one of a couple of projects that the state is now looking at. In fact, one in South Florida already appears to be fast-tracked and actually underway. This project people are calling Alligator Alcatraz. When something is coming to fruition this close to a budget cycle, where's that money coming from? Who is funding it? Does it have to be something that the legislature co-signs, or can the governor just say this is the way it is?
All questions that I expect sort of to be asked in the sort of months to come, Ann, because you say this is something that's come together very quickly. But obviously the state of Florida has passed some new laws in the last couple of years regarding sort of immigration and immigration detention and enforcement. One of the ways they are implementing those laws is, as you say, the creation of what people are calling Alligator Alcatraz on the site of what was going to be the Everglades Jetport in kind of right in the dead center of South Florida, right outside the Everglades. This at one point was going to be one of the biggest airports in the world before it was scrapped in the late 60s, early 70s. It now is just as they'd started construction, so it now has some of the longest runways in the world, just kind of right in the middle of the Everglades. It is now owned by Miami-Dade County. The state is sort of taking it over to serve as a detention facility to house up to 5,000 undocumented immigrants that the state detains. It will not be inexpensive to run. I think the projections are about $450 million a year. The state indicates that it is going to be reimbursed by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, for that work, and is looking to sort of build out capacity in other parts of the state. And the other day, the governor mentioned that one of those sites is Camp Landing in Clay County, just south of Jacksonville. It's a
I'm
Florida.
sorry, Clay County, sure.
Yeah, it's a Florida National Guard site that again they would potentially put temporary sites in there. We don't know anything about what that cost would be or what that would look like. But again, what the governor's emphasizes that he says he's gotten a commitment from the federal government to reimburse at least for the South Florida site. As for some of these other sites, that seems less clear at this point as to whether or not there is a federal commitment to reimburse the state for any funding.
And so, I mean, there is already a ICE detention facility. The Department of Homeland Security contracts with Baker County's jail, and that's typically where those inmates go when they're waiting some sort of processing by the federal government. So this would be in addition to that, and perhaps even competing with it. We don't know, whether federal money would be available, but I mean, Camp Landing is an interesting proposal. It actually, some people will know, used to house POWs back in World War II, and so it has some history in terms of being used, to detain people. And it sounds like the Florida National Guard is sort of on board with the idea of apportioning some part of that facility for a detention facility. But another military facility, Cecil Field in West Jacksonville, was years ago, when it was decommissioned, there was a discussion about should it become a prison, should it become a maximum security prison, a lot of community outcry. I mean, would it be any different to have an ICE detention facility going into a former, active military base like Camp Landing? What would the community reaction be?
Well, I think that'll be very interesting to track over time because, again, this idea just became public in the last few days that the state was considering this. Just for folks who maybe not are not quite as familiar with Clay County, where Camp Landing is located. Obviously, Orange Park is in the kind of northeast side of Clay County. South from that is Green Cove Springs. Camp Landing is sort of due west of Green Cove Springs, sort of between Middleburg in western Clay County and Keystone Heights, which is sort of further south in Clay County. So it's in a fairly unpopulated part of Clay County. Still, Clay County is one of the fastest growing counties in the state. This is not that far from where the Outer Beltway is kind of being constructed. There's a huge growth, new homes being constructed in Clay County. So I think it will be very interesting to track venues like the Clay County Commission and to sort of see what the reaction is there, and from individual cities like Middleburg, Keystone Heights, Penny Farms, another community that's right near there as well, to see what the reaction is in those cities and counties to this announcement, which again is very new, just became public in the last few days.
Sure. We're talking to Chris Hand about state budget proposals, possible funding vetoes, and you can join our conversation on air by calling 904-549-2937. You can also email comments or questions to firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. One thing that did earn some funding in this budget, and the outcome, again, with the vetoes pending unclear, is the seawall in Fernandina Beach. It's a very significant project for that downtown historic district, which is very prone to flooding from the Amelia River during high tides and heavy rainstorms. So this would be a $4 million allocation. And it is just a portion of what's needed for this, almost $20 million project, but it's a piecemeal thing that they're building, and some of it has been constructed. So how has resiliency fared, generally speaking, when it comes to this governor and his veto pen? And what's your expectations for a project like this?
Well, again, I think governors go through a lot of levels of analysis, and we talked earlier about some of the back and forth between the governor and the House, but I think there are other lenses that a governor uses often when trying to make a decision about budget vetoes. One is, does this project have some broader significance, whether that's for a region or for the entire state, or is it purely local? Or is it consistent with kind of other goals that we've had? I mean, the state has funded a variety of sort of resilience and other, projects over the years. So I don't know that this one would be seen as inconsistent with that. And of course, citizen and legislator advocacy makes a big difference in this as well. People communicating with the governor's office. I think one piece of advice I would always give to anyone who's interested in something that's in the state budget while it's pending before the governor is use your powers of effective citizenship to reach out to the governor's office and make sure that they're aware of either the broad-based local support for this or why this project is important. But those kind of communications can make a big difference in this project and whether a project stays in the budget or goes out. And certainly that that $4 million for Fernandina Beach, a very significant issue for Nassau County. So I expect they're doing that right now.
Sure, and something like that, which can be sort of narrowly regional beneficial, can also have greater statewide import if people say, well, it's a big tourism draw. A lot of people like to go to Fernandina, and so it therefore impacts the state on a broader level.
That's right. And those are the kinds of arguments that I expect and will be used in this process, not just for this project, but for a variety of other projects as well. So I think, again, it's really important to the extent citizens or local leaders want to try and keep their particular appropriation in the budget. Now is definitely the time to be communicating with the governor's office to make sure they understand the importance of that project and why it should escape his veto pen going forward. This is not a time for anyone who's interested in a project to just sort of sit back and wait and hope for the best. Those sorts of communications can be really important.
Yeah, and one project that is commanding those messages on both sides, supporters and opponents, is the future of the Rodman Reservoir, sometimes the Rodman Dam. It's actually the Kirkpatrick Dam, but it's a damming of the Ocklawaha River. It was supposed to be part of this cross Florida barge canal, and it was an essential piece, and then that project was abandoned, sort of like the airstrip down in the Everglades. There's kind of a little theme there sometimes in Florida.
They're both of the same vintage. I mean, both happened in the kind of late 60s, early 70s. The federal government had authorized what's called the Cross Florida Barge Canal. You can actually still see that if you drive over State Road 19 in Putnam County. See where the state sort of cut through that barge canal that was going to connect the East Coast to the West Coast of Florida. Project was not finished. It was canceled by President Nixon in 1971, but the remnants of it remain. And one of those remnants is the Rodman Reservoir, the Kirkpatrick Dam, right there in Putnam County. And as you say, Ann, this has been a source of fierce debate over the years, with a variety of people, opposing and supporting the continued existence of the dam. I remember when I worked for Senator Bob Graham in the 1990s in Washington, the debate raged. Senator Graham at one point made a trip down there to sort of hear from both sides of the issue. But
Remind us what both sides are. I mean,
Yeah.
because there is a strong lobby to keep it, and there's a strong push to remove it.
Right, and just to remind folks what happened there when the barge canal was being built, as a way to help facilitate the construction of that canal, they built this dam, the series of locks kind of up and down the Ocklawaha River, which is the main tributary of the St. Johns River. It actually flows north, like the St. Johns. It sort of flows north from Lake County up and joins the St. Johns River in Putnam County. But the series of locks that were put in, and the Rodman Dam is part of that, to kind of stop the natural flow of the Ocklawaha River. Over time, that has developed into what Putnam County officials say is an economic engine, the bass fishing industry, recreational sport fishing, those sorts of things, tourism. Folks who are kind of supportive of that have said that we should keep the dam in place because otherwise it would kind of deprive Putnam County of an economic engine. On the other hand, you have a variety of other people, whether they are environmentalists, even some from an economic and business standpoint, who have said not only has this done significant damage to the Ocklawaha River in terms of flows and nutrient levels and creation of algal blooms and the submerging of springs that are there in the Ocklawaha, but it's also had an economic impact. That their argument is if you were to undam the river there, restore its natural flow, that would create other recreational opportunities. They argue would not hurt the fishing industry, would just move it a little bit upstream where it was prior to the creation of the dam. And both sides have sort of come out with studies which sort of show, which kind of help to support their position. So it's been a debate that's been raging for a long time. And what this appropriation would does, and again, this isn't necessarily a partisan thing because the main sponsor of this is State Senator Jason Brodeur from Central Florida. He's a Republican, who has said that he believes that the undamming of the river would have both economic and environmental benefits. and so we'll have to see kind of what the governor ultimately does this year. Last year, there was a $500,000 appropriation in the budget to study the status of the dam and whether it should be unblocked. That was vetoed. This year, obviously, a significantly greater amount of money, $6.25 million, to actually start the work of removing portions of the dam to restore the flow of the Ocklawaha. We'll probably know in the next several days whether that is vetoed or not.
But this would really be the first time that level of funding to actually remove this dam has made it into the budget.
That would be a sea change in state policy, which for years, and again, you really do have, this is a situation where you have very interesting coalitions on both sides. The state senator for the area, Tom Leake, has come out against the appropriation. He's urging the governor to veto it. So is the Putnam County Commission. But you also have people like State Senator Brodeur from Central Florida, which is obviously the St. Johns River, flows north from there. So it's very much affected by what happens in Putnam County. You've got the environmental community, obviously championed by groups like the Florida Defenders of the Environment, was created by Marjorie Harris Carr, who was the main advocate who stopped the construction of the Cross Florida Barge Canal. You've got other political officials. The mayor of Palatka has come out in favor of this particular appropriation and wants the governor to keep that in the budget. So again, in that old saying that politics makes for strange bedfellows, there are some very interesting coalitions both for and against that. And I think it reflects the intensity of feeling that has existed for many years on the issue of what should the state of the Ocklawaha River be? What should the future of the Rodman Reservoir be? And we'll have some answers to that in the next several days.
And another major environmental, funding question comes around the money for Florida Forever. This is a project that it was established specifically so that the state could go and acquire lands that were either threatened by development or just incredibly, special, unique places that were deserving of protection. And, that money, how it's spent, whether it's allocated, has been, a big political hot potato for, as long as the program has existed. But this year is, basically a very small funding year. Lawmakers have cut from last year way, way back on the money that they've set aside for this land acquisition. So tell us what's happening with the Florida Forever funding.
Well, let's go back a decade, Ann, to 2014, where voters actually passed a constitutional amendment to the ballot, the Florida Land and Water Conservation Amendment, which was supposed to ensure that a certain amount of funding each year went into this sort of land acquisition and preservation that you're talking about.
A reaction to the fact that it kind of wasn't happening.
Yeah, that's right. And so there was again, sort of a citizen-led movement to kind of help make that change. It was made part of the Florida Constitution, but there's been a lot of controversy about it since then in terms of how that amendment's been implemented by the legislature. As you say, some of that controversy continues to this year because the legislature's commitment to the Florida Forever program, which is one of those means of, acquiring threatened lands, significantly, less funding than in previous years as well. Look, you don't have to look back more than just several years ago when former State Senator Rob Bradley was the Senate Appropriations Chair, and he ensured that a record amount of funding was in the budget for land acquisition and preservation. Just a few years later, we're in a very different situation. So I think expect to see that continue to come up as an issue in the years to come, because that tends to be funding which is popular, tends to have support across partisan lines, but again, this year has been significantly reduced in the budget.
Yeah, and so for the last several years since 2021, that fund has gotten at least $100 million every year. This year, just $18 million slated for it. But it also sort of signals a shift in perhaps the way of thinking, priorities of the legislature, because while they are not funding Florida Forever by much, they are funding $250 million to a program called the Rural and Family Lands Protection Program. And basically what that allows for is paying for something that's called a conservation easement on land that's either owned by farmers or ranchers. And so that's different. It is a way of conserving land, but tell us a little bit about how that might suggest just how we're thinking differently about ways to preserve land.
Well, and I think that is probably somewhat in keeping with, the State Senate President Ben Albritton, who's from Wauchula, Florida, in West Florida, a very rural area. He is identified as one of his major priorities for the legislature what he's calling the Rural Renaissance, which is a series of investments to kind of help boost economic development, quality of life in rural parts of Florida. That Rural Renaissance itself did not pass this year, but the appropriation you're talking about is very much aligned and in keeping with that overall approach. I would actually expect to see more of that funding, that sort of rural conservation easement funding in the future, particularly in the second year of Senator Albritton's time as Senate President, because I think it is very consistent with his overall approach to try and sort of help provide some additional kind of relief to rural areas through the state budget.
And so one thing that that does, as we said, is, it puts a conservation, basically a block on land. It preserves it so it's not subject to sprawl. It can't be turned later on into a giant community or some sort of development, but it doesn't make it public. And so that is, something that it keeps it in a private ownership. It doesn't provide access to the citizens of Florida. And so it's an expenditure that is one tool, but maybe one that doesn't necessarily provide all that some environmentalists want when it comes to keeping certain lands pristine.
That's right. Well, look, the conservation ideal is to not just have property that is public and thus protected from development or other sort of threats to it, but also that the public has access to, right, that they can use. Anytime you're hiking in a state park or a state preserve or a water management district conservation area, those are all lands that have not only been preserved, but have also been opened up for public recreation and enjoyment. And that is ultimately the ideal. And I think what many of these programs were, designed to achieve when they were first put into place, whether that was Preservation 2000 back when kind of Jeb Bush was governor, which sort of evolved into Florida Forever. Preservation and public access tend to be. So you're right. That is a controversy about, some of these developments. We'll have to see going into future legislatures whether there is a kind of a renewed commitment to some of those programs. Because again, they've been very popular, bipartisan over the years. And again, just in the several years ago, we had a situation where the legislature was putting record amounts into that program. So as the state enters what may be a tighter, more fiscally lean period, I think this will be one of those discussions we continue to have. How will the state fund land preservation? There is a constitutional amendment which says they're supposed to do that at certain levels, and so I think that debate will continue.
Arts funding is another area that is maybe seeing a little bit of a seismic shift in terms of how the legislature thinks about who is going to get funding. And I want to ask you about that because last year the governor entirely slashed all of the state art grants, 100%. He cut $32 million out of the budget. It really stunned arts organizations across the state. This year there is funding back, a little bit more than was allocated last year, $39 million. But there's a change in the kinds of organizations that have been chosen by the legislature for funding. What has changed there?
And I think part of the concern is, as you say, last year the governor vetoed every sort of arts and cultural project in the budget. For those locally, there ended up being a bit of a double whammy because the governor vetoed all those funds, and then there was less funding available than anticipated in the city of Jacksonville budget for some of that arts funding as well. This year, while the legislature has put money in, had that's been allocated to sort of larger organizations, some of the smaller organizations that really count on that money don't seem to be included in some of this arts funding. From some of the initial analysis of the budget, again, we don't know if the governor will kind of repeat his overall veto approach. But I think from the perspective of arts organizations, the change that many of them are concerned about is that the legislature, in its process, has appropriated this to sort of larger organizations, which might be less dependent on this funding than some of the smaller arts organizations, which have really counted on it over time.
And shifting to larger organizations that also might be a little less controversial in terms of the work that they produce. Because last year, one of the things that the governor cited when he zeroed out that funding was fringe festivals, things that he thought were promoting, messaging that he didn't agree with. And so this year's shift to larger, more established organizations might actually show a sort of a different set of priorities when it comes to the kind of arts programs that the state will fund.
Well, and I think we have to think about this not just at the state level, but also at the federal level, where obviously there are significant reductions in funds and cultural grants and other things that might help organizations, and at the city and county level as well. We'll talk about this more next month, but I know city and county governments around the country and around the state are now dealing with very increasingly difficult budget situations. I think one very key issue to watch in the upcoming City of Jacksonville budget will be how does the mayor's office propose funding our cultural service grants here in the city of Jacksonville, particularly in light of whatever the governor does from a veto standpoint. That has become an important lifeline for arts and cultural organizations, so it will certainly be an issue to watch as the mayor proposes her budget in July.
All right. Well, we will be talking next month about the city budget. But Chris, thanks so much for helping us break down the state budget. We love seeing you.
Great to see you as always, Ann. Thank you.
All right. Great. Up next, it's a good weekend to find your new best friend. We'll tell you how in just a minute.
Looking for a cool escape this summer? Catch the classic film noir DOA at WJCT Studios, Wednesday, July 2nd. Doors at 6:30, movie at 7. It's a special summer noir night, because who says we have to wait for Noirvember to get our mystery fix?
I want to report a murder. Who was murdered? I was.
Killer vibes, vintage style, and a story that still hits hard. Grab your tickets now at WJCT.org/film. DOA. See it before time runs out.
On the next Fresh Air, Pulitzer Prize-winning fashion critic Robin Gavon joins us to discuss her new book, Make It Ours, Crashing the Gates of Culture with Virgil Abloh. She traces the late designer's unconventional path to luxury fashion, how he challenged tradition and opened once closed doors, and why she believes he may be one of the last of his kind. Join us.
Today at noon on WJCT News 89.9.
The Trump administration is looking at how to persuade more women to have children, maybe paying bonuses or awarding so-called medals of motherhood to help boost declining fertility rates.
So let me say very simply, I want more babies in the United States of America.
I'm Deborah Becker. What would it take to create a new baby boom? That's on the next On Point.
Today at 11 on WJCT News 89.9.
They've never served in the military. They don't strictly work in defense, but they're now lieutenant colonels in the U.S. Army Reserves, tasked with making the armed forces, quote, leaner, smarter, and more lethal. 4 tech executives from companies like Meta and OpenAI are the Army Executive Innovation Corps' newest officers. What you need to know about this new initiative, that's next time on 1A.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. Well, if you're looking for a little more love in your life, it may not be that hard to find. You might just meet your new best friend this weekend. A mega pet adoption here and across the state has literally hundreds of cats and kittens, dogs, and puppies needing a place to call home. And here to tell us about it is longtime animal advocate Lawrence Nicholas, CEO of the Jacksonville Humane Society.
Good
Welcome,
morning. Good
Lawrence.
morning, Ann. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you. So this is an event that is a statewide event. Of course, people are going to be excited to know more about it. But why is there this partnership right now? I mean, I understand that there's a little bit of a different supply and demand thing that happens in the summer. What is going on?
It is. Many folks don't realize that the pet shelter intake is very, very seasonal. So during the late spring and early summer months, we see by far the most animals come into our shelter here at the Jacksonville Humane Society. And that's true really across the entire country.
Why?
The primary driver is cats and kittens, cats breeding, and then we call it kitten season in our world, kitten season. And kitten season starts really in late April, and it carries through May and into June, whereas we'll take in, at JHS, we take in about 9,000 animals a year, and a good percentage of that comes in just these couple of months. So it's why a big adoption event like we're hosting next weekend is so important, that right now is the time that shelters have the most animals available for adoption. So it's a twofer, it's a win-win, that we're able to place as many animals as we can during the time that we need it the most, but people who are looking to adopt a pet also have the widest variety, the most selections of animals that they might be looking for because there is so much choice right now.
And you work with the Humane Society here in Jacksonville, but you're also partnering with like Animal Care and Control. Who is partnering this at this big fairgrounds event?
So we, Jacksonville Humane Society, we have a statewide initiative that we call Florida Leaders in Life Saving. So that is an initiative managed by the Jacksonville Humane Society that brings life saving across the entire state of Florida. So under our banner, we're hosting this pet adoption event along with our friends at Petco Love. So we have at the fairgrounds, we'll have 11 different shelters available for having animals available for adoption. But then across the entire state over the weekend, we'll actually have more than 50 shelters participating. So everywhere from Miami-Dade Animal Services to the Pensacola Humane Society and 48 shelters in between are going to be participating in this event this weekend.
And so you're looking to place, maybe as many as 2,000 pets.
Yeah.
That's a lot of pets. I'm curious, what you advise people to think about, to prepare for, to plan for if they're coming to an event like this. I mean, it's great when they're able to find an animal, bring it home, but sometimes it helps to have a little bit of a plan in place.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely smart. Begin with the end in mind, if you will. Think about before you go, have an idea. Are we going to adopt today? Are there certain things that we could do before we go adopt? Make sure we've got the crate and the food and the toys and a quiet place for the pet to kind of settle in, or anything like that is a great idea. Making sure everybody's on board that now is a good time to adopt. But we really try to make it as easy as we can to take home a pet. That there's not a lot of barriers. There's not a lot of boundaries. If you're ready to take home a pet this weekend, we're going to do everything that we can to help make that possible. And then I think just having being grounded in your expectations is always a good idea, whether you're adopting a pet this weekend, next weekend, or a year from now. I like to compare it sometimes to, honestly, people dating. And it's not, most people don't marry the first person that they date.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes it does take a little bit of feeling out till you want to adopt a pet. You'll take somebody home, and if it doesn't end up being the perfect fit the first time, that's not a bad thing. That's an okay thing. You've learned something more about your family. We've learned something more about this pet, and we'll try to adopt somebody else next time.
What is a good way to sort of know, though, if you've got a good match? And when you talk about expectations, how do people kind of make sure that they're, I remember one of our pets that we adopted, the first thing she did when she got in the house was she peed in the porch, and it was like, well, yeah, we have to take her out before we bring her in, but kind of getting yourself ready for the idea that, there's going to be accidents. There's going to be sort of challenges. If you've got kids in the house, how do you prepare them? What are some of the things that people can do to sort of make sure that their expectations are appropriate and to sort of know really what they're looking for in a pet?
Sure. Yeah. And I think it's good to keep in mind that if the pet is new in your home, it's new for the pet too. This is an entirely new world for them. They went from wherever they were before to a shelter for a short stay, and then now in your home. That's 3 pretty big life changes under a pretty short period of time. So sometimes it's best to just let them have their space, figure out their own environment, those kinds of things. And then for what we can do as the pet owners is establish some kinds of routines that then that pet can live around. That I know I'm going to get to go outside every 4 to 6 hours, or I know that by and large the kids come home from school when the bus drives down the street, and just having these routines in place that then now the white space can fill with what their life's going to look like, but they can at least start by having these really set routines. I've found that helps transition animals into a home setting much more quickly versus everything's just kind of always in flux or changing or anything like that.
So kind of when are the hours? When are people invited to come to the fairgrounds this weekend?
10 to 6, both Saturday and Sunday. We'll also be doing adoptions at JHS at the shelter on Beach Boulevard on Friday. And then that, like I said, that this adoption promotion is at every shelter, really most shelters across the entire state during the weekend, and also at quite a few Petco stores.
And we should say the fees are waived. That's part of the promotion.
It sure is. Yeah. Fees are waived. There may be a nominal fee for a pet license or something like that, depending on the city that you live in, but that's like $20. Standard adoption fees are waived across the board.
But donations, I'm sure, are welcome.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
No question about it.
All right. Well, Lawrence Nicholas, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Dan. Really appreciate the time.
All right. And thank you for listening. If you have questions or comments, you can send either to First Coast Connect at WJCT.org. And join us tomorrow when our panel of experts discusses the week's biggest headlines for council support for a rare mayoral veto to a lawsuit over a smelly St. Johns County biomass facility. I'm Ann Schindler. You've been listening to First Coast Connect on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. The North Florida TPO is dedicated to transportation planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, resilient, and connected region. More information available at northfloridatpo.com.
More than a century ago, a company called Calum helped Jacksonville become the winter film capital of the world, a reputation that lasted only a decade. Hear the fascinating true story on Bygone Jacks, Our Unsung History, a podcast from WJCT Public Media.